one meaningful part out of that is a lot of the perennial efforts to save on the expense side have now caused what otherwise would be expense items to become capital items. And they, honestly, in combination, have started to be some pretty big numbers, but more detail when we get there. The objective is certainly to revitalize the parks and reverse the trend from decline to vibrant. And for that, the essence of one of our messages is that we think a new funding model is warranted, and conversation around a new funding model is warranted. On to the more exciting part, which is where do we go from here? For a renaissance of the parks, and I think that's a powerful word, because I am going to try to make an appeal to the emotional connection that people have with parks, the experiences they've had in parks, and the memories they've had with parks for that matter. We have some functional areas that we set about to address. Probably first and foremost is just the goals and the strategies that we've identified. For the goals, we have 5 focus areas, and those are stewardship, most importantly perhaps, is just taking care of these physical settings and the buildings and fixtures that comprise these physical settings. Second fundamental goal focus area would be funding, which I have alluded to already. A third would be management and operations, and it's management in terms of attitude, and it's operations in terms of having real decision-making templates, prioritizing, and then being consistent across the years that we try to effectuate the new plan. The fourth area would be just products and programming. Are there products that we could make available that generate, a more relevant park to somebody that otherwise doesn't go to parks? Are there programs that allow them to come more frequently to these parks because they're now starting to have a relationship with our staff or the experiences that they're forming in the parks? And then the last but not least is the statutory framework. We think, by last count, there are better than 500 statutes that do in fact mention the word park or state park system. Some of those have become somewhat cumbersome, if not contradictory over time. We want to set about to identify in a priority order those that are most cumbersome or most contradictory to allow us to just on a daily basis, achieve the mandated objectives that do exist. As it relates to the operations, we do make a recommendation in what I'm now calling a 5-step process for what I hope will be known from here forward as more appropriate management for the parks. And it calls for us to do and continue to do yeoman's work on just finding information about the parks, which is, do we have an inventory that represents the parks as they currently stand? Essentially a catalog of information, which is how many toilet facilities, bathhouses, tables, fire rings, campsites, so on and so on. But those are some of the obvious physical statistics. We have performance statistics. And then there are still probably some unknowns out there, which are there threatened species, are there native cultural plant communities that we just haven't identified that should and could impact what we might do in a given park. So that's obviously very important. We're in pretty good shape, but there's still distance to cover there. With that information in front of us, we want to start sorting and grouping parks by those attributes, and I will suggest those attributes would be grouped by strengths and similarity. And we think that certainly beats looking at the weakness of any system to just cull that which isn't performing. More importantly, let's accentuate the positive and group by strength and similarity. Once that becomes more clear, I think we can set about to prioritize the capital investment that's needed. Some of the expenses that haven't been met now become capital items. They are meaningful even in terms of next summer's operation. How can we allocate additional capital if we're fortunate enough to get it to the right end and to the right objective? The fifth step of that 5-step process becomes trying to effectuate management and operations that are appropriate to the group. So if a park in fact generates revenue, it does well by visitation, we'll continue to pursue revenue and we'll continue to increase visitation. We won't do that recklessly, we won't do it and compromise our integrity of the gorgeous settings, but we do need to pursue additional revenue if we can. That park or those group of parks that would pursue those very objectives may be very different than a park which I, for lack of a better term, might call a natural park, which doesn't generate revenue at all or not much, certainly doesn't cover expenses, and frankly that's okay. And its setting and its the nature that it represents and that we're trying to preserve allows that to be a very comfortable philosophy. But those would be two ends, and in the middle we might have what I'm currently calling classic parks, which have a little bit of everything. They're not a strong revenue generator, but nor are they one that doesn't have more potential. would we approach the management and the presentation and sort of the messages that we try to create about that park differently than one that sits at either the enterprise end or the natural end. The last piece would be the new funding model. We would just seek, I guess, resolution via the new funding model and conversation surrounding that topic to 2 or 3 meaningful pieces. We do have what we call a carry forward loss, which is sort of the accumulation of that shortfall across time, and we do our darndest and our best to offset that. That's been very difficult, and as I mentioned, among numbers, at least in the last 20 years, we haven't necessarily succeeded. That number as of June 30th, just a few months ago, when fiscal year 2009 closed, was as much as $1.8 million. That's part of the hole that I have referenced and continue to think just makes some of the tasks daunting on a daily basis out in the field. Another part that should come into consideration under the funding model would be about $1.7 million that's been identified through a very intensive capital improvement plan for just stabilization of facilities that are probably needed in the next 3 years. This fiscal year and the capital allocated there is set, but in the ensuing biennium of 12-13, we would hope to have a conversation that might allow us to stabilize a greater percentage of the facilities in the hopes of making sure they continue to operate well and stay open. The numbers get a little bigger after that, and the detail is in the plan, so I don't know if today is a good time to worry about all the nuance of that, but we do see probably another $28 million that's required over the next 5 years to not just take these parks from a stabilized situation, but to one that we can be very proud of and be presenting a much more vibrant set of facilities and experiences. And then across the lifespan of the plan, which is 10 years, the number is as high as $75 million. And that's obviously a conversation that needs to take place. But again, a third party has done for us what they do for other entities out there to assess just the state of the physical plant in the parks, and has put, at this point, with the help of our staff, who worked diligently over the last 2 years, a number to that, and that's about $75 million. So those start to be sobering numbers, but they're ones that I think are meaningful if we're going to address and create a park system of which the citizens can be very proud. So I hope that provides some insight as to what the plan is comprised of. I certainly would be anxious and willing to answer some questions. I think more important now, and we'll look at questions at the end, to let some others chime in.